Hello class, we are doing now week 7. This is the beginning of it. You're reading Sire's book on the universe next door, and it is now going to deal with 3 topics. One of them is going to be naturalism in chapter 4, the silence of the finite space. Then you're going to have nihilism, which is 0 point, or the denial of any value in existence. And then you have existentialism, which is an attempt to find meaning in the world. So I'll take some time to explain each one of them to the best of my ability. Now, I will be appealing to certain sources that I have read over the years and others that come to mind. I have quite an experience in this area. This is something that I lived in the flesh as I was in unbelief. I experienced went from pessimism. First began with skepticism, then moved to pessimism, then nihilism, and then existentialism. So those are phases that are very familiar. I'm familiar with the literature and the ideas that surrounds them. So I'll try to do the best I can to bring to mind some of the central tenets to keep in mind. So as we proceed now, let us look at some of the titles that I would recommend in this section. If you are not familiar with Francis Schaeffer, this is a book that was instrumental in my conversion to Christianity. It's a trilogy of books. It's The God Who Is There and Is Now Silent is one. Escape from Reason, and He Is There and He Is Now Silent is the third one. This one is a very short one, Escape from Reason, very helpful and kind of giving you a flow of the history of ideas and where things have gone. Very much worth your time. Francis Schaeffer he's an apologist, a worldview apologist. He was one of the first pioneering that idea of worldviews in the 1970s, 1670s and 80s. He created a study center called Liavri in Switzerland, which became very famous because all of the people that were struggling in the West with the emptiness of materialism in Europe and the United States during the hippie movement, he opened his doors for them to come to Liavri and engage in meaningful discussions regarding the purpose of existence and Christianity and sin and death and many aspects of that. So out of that evangelical spirit of his came through painstaking these works that he wrote. And I put a video for you guys. Let me check the sources that I use for you in this in completing this unit. So let me see. I uploaded a few helpful resources that you can use. Some of them are videos, some of them are literature, and I'll explain each one briefly to you so we can get a sense of what I'm looking for when I share those with you. So far I'm going to put my own lectures, and then you have Marquis de Sade, a dialogue between a dying man and a priest, very important. Then you have the myth of Sisyphus, which I am going to go ahead and go over with you guys in more detail because I have the book with me. Unfortunately, I'm in the middle of a move, and so I have about 45 boxes of books in front of me in what is to be my office, and I don't have a place to store them, and nor do I have them available to me at this moment. So I digged out a few in some discernible places, and then I put a short. It is a documentary series that he came up with. It's titled "How Should We Then Live?" And what that documentary does is Francis Schaeffer explaining to us in the 1970s and early 80s what the consequences of secularism will going to be in culture, and how widespread and how dehumanizing those practices were to become. Now, this is at the beginning when Roe versus Wade and abortion begins to come into the scene, when no-fault divorce becomes prevalent. Now divorce is permissible without sufficient reason in a classical sense that had been there in Christian morality. And then of course all the things that we have seen in the rampant use of violence and sex and gender and all of the things that we have seen, and the Me Too movement expressing the constant loss that there is there and the abuse of power. So all of those things were spoken of to a large degree by Francis Schaeffer back in the day. The environmentalist movement, he addressed that. He also addressed the unending deficits and inflation that comes from a consumeristic economy, the unending desire to satisfy the need for meaning by use of material benefits. So I like to just point that out to you. That is the first part of several. I believe he has like 3 or 4 parts to it. But it is a very the filming, of course, is outdated, just like my videoing, but the content of it is going to be something that will be worth your time. It is very impactful, very profound, and get over his quirkiness. He's a man that has a peculiar outlook, and remember, he lives in Switzerland, so he dresses differently and a few other things. But I will go ahead and proceed in describing some of these things to you guys. So if I were to assess the development of naturalism as a worldview and thinking, it's a turn towards this worldliness. For too long, the West had emphasized the life to come and the blessing that was to be found in heaven. And I mentioned Karl Marx in the past. This is a helpful little book. It is divided into many chapters. I don't agree with every interpretation of it, but those are things that you may want to look through. It's called The Architects of the Culture of Death. And the chapters are short. I mean, they're 12, 13 pages. You can take one a day and just kind of glance through it. And what it does is that it covers several aspects of our culture and how it has been influenced by these people in the past and what the consequences have been. So he has the will worshippers, and he has people like Arthur Schopenhauer, somebody who I used to read and admire, Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand used to be very famous in the 1980s, Atlas Shrugged, and I forgot the name of the other one that she has, but very, very what's called anarcho-capitalist perspectives, where all the needs provided for a human being can be provided by the market, and we don't need government. Government is a usurpation. It's simply a group of people that have duped us into making use of the law to extract money from us and to subjugate us, but we in reality don't need government for anything. So she has a very if you want to call it selfish. She was brought up in the Soviet Union, so her sense of identity or individualism was denied, and she became uber individualistic, where any help to anyone is a disgrace. It's a denial of the theory of evolution, and you are doing harm to people by helping them. Either they are able to survive and thrive on their own, or they should die. So altruism is completely and utterly denied. Her ethical theory, is called objectivism, and so it was quite prevalent back in the day, but today has subsided. Then you have a few other people, what's called the eugenic revolution, and of course eugenics is the tempering of changing of human nature and trying to force sterilization on people to enable them to comply with certain genetic criteria that is to be had. So Charles Darwin is grouped with this. Now, Charles Darwin would not have endorsed of eugenics. He still had the 19th century Christian British Victorian worldview, and he even says in The Ascent of Men, he says that as human beings, we will only take care of those who, in accordance to evolution, will only take care of those the strongest, which are able to survive, and let those to die who are unable to exist on their own. But he says, given our sensibility and kindness and gentleness and mercy, we as human beings would find that unconscionable. Well, what he found unconscionable, others did not, like the Nazi movement. Then you have, of course, Francis Galton, supporter of Darwin and Darwinism, and then Ernst Haeckel and the Haeckel drawings and the whole controversy involving that. But so what you have there is what's called social Darwinism, which is not the same as Darwinism simpliciter. Social Darwinism are the moral consequence or the moral implications of the theory of evolution that And evolutionists may not endorse because they lack concern for consistency on their belief system. So, but those who make sense of it and try to live by it, the consequence is something like eugenics. To put it this way, applying eugenics is like applying intelligence to a blind process. Why should we allow nature to take its course and wait for those who are incapable of contributing to the species to be weeded out? Why don't we put our energies to work and select them ourselves? So apply intelligence, plan in the future developments of the human race. And then you have what's called the secular utopianist, Karl Marx being one of them, Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte had a conception that we were always moving forward and leading towards greater and fuller understanding. You have the existentialist. But Karl Marx is going to be one of those significant developments that led to naturalism. Karl Marx turned what's called Hegel on its head. Karl Marx is going to be the socio-economical, materialistic forces, the underlying current of history. And he was utterly, and he found himself in a world that was suffocated by excuses, the development of the industrial age, and of course the abuses of child labor and things of that kind. He found himself quite raging. He believed himself to be like that Greek. What was his name? Let me think of him. The Greek god that took fire from the gods and gave it to the humans because of his love of humanity. The gods wanted to destroy human beings, and then he came and gave them intelligence. So he said Prometheus. So he found himself being a figure like Prometheus, where he was going to, as a prophet, tell us what the future was to have. And unless we renounce this absurd conception of religion, which serves as the opium of the masses, there is a deep problem with the human beings, and that is their complacency to all their worldliness. And the only way in which we can cure that misery is by putting emphasis in this life. All we have is this life, and if we all work together, and if we stop dreaming, countless dreams of religions as to what the life to come is going to bring, we can eradicate hunger and homelessness and all the other psychological problems and so on can be eradicated. Religion is the opium of the masses. It is the expression of a heartless world. Religion exists because misery exists. If we can eradicate misery, we can eradicate religion. So religion, he saw it as a numbing of the human person, and we needed to destroy it. And that's why communist regimes were always have always been antithetical and at odds with religion and persecuting it. So Karl Marx is going to be that impetus behind naturalism. Let's take the future in our hands. Workers of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our chains. That's one of the most famous expressions from Karl Marx in his Communist Manifesto from 1848. There's not much that is new in Marx, but what he did, he had an ability of and you can read it's an excellent chapter in The Intellectuals by Paul Johnson. If you haven't read Paul Johnson, I highly recommend him. He's a British historian, conservative, and he has a chapter on the lives or the practical lives of those people like Karl Marx and let me see who is another one, Jean-Paul Sartre and others. How are they really like as human beings? And you get a glimpse into that way of life that was just despicable. But he says, and he wisely noticed, and I think very, very intuitively, is there was not much new in Karl Marx, but he had this ability to be in like a newspaper writer who had these beautiful lines that kind of captured a movement, and then he became the forefront of it when he was not the founder of communism that was there. There were many and even in the Communist Manifesto, when you read it at the end of it, you have several warring camps and who is a true communist and so on. Then you have Sigmund Freud and the sex planners. Margaret Mead, Alfred Kinsey, what a despicable human being, and Margaret Sanger. And then, of course, the death peddlers, which is those who advocate euthanasia and speciesism like Peter Singer. So I will continue on describing some of these people in the next lecture.